All right. Thank you so much. It's so exciting to talk with you. To just jump right into it, can you tell us a little bit about you and your practice?
Sure. So my name is Luar Adonis Wolf. My pronouns are they, them, she, hers. In Spanish, also go by ella and ella, the feminine and the gender neutral pronouns in Spanish. I'm 29 years old. I live in New York City on occupied Lenape Hoking land. And I'm also intersex, queer, non-binary, also identify as trans, and I am a non-Black person of color, specifically Dominican and Puerto Rican. Whew. Uh, multitude of identities that are just part of my everyday lived experience. Um, in terms of my practice, so my practice or my business or whatever I'm gonna call it is called Little Moonlight Doula. And the reason why it's called Little Moonlight Doula is because it's actually named after my first name. My first name means Luar, which is Portuguese for moonlight. So in Portuguese, Little Moonlight will be Luarinha. And it was a nickname given to me by some of my Brazilian friends. And then my first birth is actually a moon named Baby after Jupiter's moon Io. So putting those one and one together, I have Little Moonlight Doula. So a moon helping bring a moon Earthside. What also makes the name unique is that my first birth was a Black non-binary person giving birth to a moon named Baby. So that is where the name of my practice comes from, and I think I'm just going to keep it forever because it literally marks who I am. And my practice is basically a full spectrum reproductive services. I do birth and postpartum. I also do the full spectrum of doula services. I am also a reproductive care worker, aka essential healthcare worker. I work with Planned Parenthood currently, and I also am part of other doula collectives. And my practice is very rooted in being gender inclusive and queer, trans, gender nonconforming, non-binary affirming, um, especially for queer, trans, BIPOC people. It's also rooted in reproductive justice, in decolonization, and so many different types of frameworks that I try to continue striving not only in my work but in myself and in my communities. And I think that's pretty much. I think that can sum the logistics of my practice. And I'm also a certified body feeding counselor and a certified childbirth educator. And that's it. It's really hard to really like name every specifics of like what you do because you're like, oh, I gotta throw this, I gotta throw this. So
Yeah.
I'm just a multitude of things that I can actually use to give back to my community and uplift my community and give my community access to specific things that they technically don't generally get access to.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally hear how like tricky it is to like try to put all of the things you do into boxes when like you are like someone who's serving your community in like ways that like may or may not actually fit into any of those roles or exclusively into any of those roles.
Yes, it's just like I'd rather put it on paper than speaking about it because then I'm like, oh, I forgot about pointing out that specific thing and that identity.
Yeah.
So I try to put it all out there. But yeah, that's what my practice does. And my practice is just me, myself, and I. Um, so it's just very solo work and doing everything.
A little moon helping other moons.
Yes.
I love it so much. It's also like one of the queerest things I've ever heard.
I had to do it. I had to make it queer as fuck.
You did, and it is. Oh, on that note, what are you queering right now, or what are some of the things you're queering right now?
So in general, I queer everything that I touch and step on, whether it's the spaces that were not designed for me, I'm going to queer it and transcend it, putting the parentheses around around transcending with a little wordplay there. Um, I touch everything, and my intention is to make sure that queer people and trans people and everybody of gender expansive identities can exist safely and be included in spaces. But specifically right now, I'm querying what doula means in terms of the full spectrum, to include and redefine the doula role, to do gender affirming support, specifically gender affirming surgeries and hormone care, and how we can be a doula for that, especially for a community that goes through these things alone and have no support and no care and very isolated. And the support that they really technically do get is literally the closest other trans friends and chosen family. And I think that those type of surgeries, especially in the recovery period, they need a lot of support. They need support that is intimate. They need support that comes from loved ones and chosen family. And they also need support that comes from a professional role in terms of like, what can I do for you? How can I help you in your recovery? How can I show up for you and make sure that you're being advocated and taken care of while you're in the hospital, during surgery and after surgery? And how do we turn this role to show up for members of our community that are just literally go through these things a majority of the time alone?
Fuck yeah. Oh, that's so important.
Yeah.
What inspired you to get into reproductive support work?
So before I even knew the word existed, it's always been there in my heart and in my ways and in my mind. And I can trace it all the way back when I was like a little adolescent. And there was one time I was actually spending the weekend with my aunt, and she was going through a divorce. And she also had gotten pregnant at that time. It was a very complicated situation without going into much detail. And for some reason, my aunt was actually going to the hospital really late at night, trying to like evade the family from knowing. So she was just making sure that me, my grandmother, my little brother, my other cousins were in bed and we were taken care of, so she can sneak out to go to the hospital. But I was up and I was very hyper aware as a little kid, and I was like a little adult. And I told my aunt, I'm like, where are you going? And she was like, I'm going to the hospital. I'm like, nobody should go to the hospital by themselves. So like, as a little kid, I was already speaking from a doula intentions and doula heart. And I was like, you shouldn't go to the hospital by yourself. Let me come with you. And she was like, no, you should stay home. I'm like, no, nobody should go to the hospital by themselves. You need someone to be with you. So I was very adamant. So she ended up taking me. And like the memories that I had that are very vivid and clear was just me being there with her. Like while she was when we got called into the OR, she was just laying on this weird like examination room. And we were literally in there for hours, and it was overnight. So I told my aunt, I'm gonna turn off the light and you just get some sleep that you can. And I just stayed vigil over her until the doctors came so she could get some rest. And then there was a part where I couldn't go with her. And then hours later, by myself, while I was in the waiting room, she comes back, and she had her own room, and they put an extra bed for me. And years later, when I have a conversation with her about that, especially now getting into this role, and I learn about miscarriages and abortions, I have a conversation with her. I'm like, did I help you? Did I give you support through something nobody else knew at the time? And she was like, yeah, I was having a miscarriage, so I had to do a DNC. And that just blew my mind. I was like, oh my God, I've been an abortion doula all my life. And so when I look back at that memory, everything just touches like, oh my gosh, she was going through an abortion and she was going to do that with the intention of doing that by herself. And I was just that little kid. I'm like, no, you shouldn't go by yourself. You need help. You need support. Let me go with you. So that's my first memory of how I got into this work. And beyond that, I was present for many of my cousins' birth or postpartum and watching body feeding and pumping and all this stuff. So I've been around all this, especially in a family that's a majority of single mothers and just women of colors. So I was very raised around that matriarch energy and witnessing the matriarch give birth to the next generation of me and my cousins, and witnessing that as an older person compared to the other cousins. And then fast forwarding, just specifically the actions that brought me to work is I got into doula work in the non-traditional, non-typical way, which is starting with abortion. And a lot of doulas that I meet usually do birth and postpartum certification and training first. That's usually what you hear the doula role for. So I actually started as an abortion doula leading into the rest. And I remember like my first day of being accepted into the doula project and being trained. And I was like, oh my God, this is needed. This is amazing. And this is also in collaboration with actually starting to work for Planned Parenthood and just exposing myself to the reproductive healthcare space, and how important it is to have access to abortions, and making sure that everybody, not just cis women, but everybody across the gender expansive identities have that same access to these services. So that's what brought me to my journey today.
Oh, I love like little baby Luar as an abortion support person. This is, oh, it's so beautiful. And I also got my start in doing support work in abortion support. So there's like I feel the
Yes. We did the backward route, like do the
I
full spectrum, then get into
that's
birth and
not how.
postpartum.
I honestly forget that that's like not how a lot of people do it. Just made a lot of sense to me at the time. And maybe you've already answered this question in your story of like no one should have to go to the hospital alone. But how do you describe your support philosophy?
It's weird because I don't ascribe to forming core values or missions and stuff, because I see that a lot with nonprofits and a lot of capitalist spaces where they're just make these philosophies and missions and core values, and it's just for branding and marketing. There's not actual authenticity or like heart to it. My philosophy for support is simple: it's everybody needs support. Everybody across the gender spectrum needs support. Everybody existing in a violent, oppressive, marginalized system needs support. So it's just give it freely, openly, and making sure everybody has access to support. So that's why a lot of my work, as much as I want to create something that's profitable or sustainable, that's the better way, sustainable. I was raised and I come from a background and a culture that is very community centered. And if I go back to that, we were not just really concerned about like how much money I can make by helping you as a community member. Yes, be sustainable for yourself, but at the end of the day, one of the ways we dismantle white supremacy is by returning back to our communities and uplifting and centering our communities and giving them access to things that they typically don't get, which is support. So that is literally my philosophy, if you want to call it that, but it's just like give support. Don't try to commercialize support. Don't try to commodify support. Don't try to capitalize support. Support is something that we as human beings should be doing for other human beings and showing up for other human beings. And that's the way we are allies, essentially, to other community members.
Yeah. Like the privatization of care just feels like one of the biggest scams to communities from like the settler colonial state.
Exactly. Honestly, like in a better and more perfect world, we wouldn't need doulas.
Yeah.
If medical racism didn't exist, or like the violation of so many people's bodies and consent and bodily autonomy didn't exist, doulas wouldn't be here, because it's just we do because of what they have done to support and what they have done to care.
Yeah. Preach it. So I've asked you about your natal work. I also need to know about your natal chart. What's your sun, moon, rising, and whatever else I need to know?
The number one queer question. It's like the first date question when you date other queers and trans folks, right? Um, my sun is Aries. I was born on April 7th. Uh, my rising is Leo, and my moon is in Capricorn. I so everybody's always asking me like, "Oh my God, you're like," because of me being a doula. I'm like, I need to know your chart so I can know what made you a doula. I'm like, it's more of like the fiery, passionate, like impulsive nature of like showing up for people. For my Aries and my Leo is the reason why I became a doula. That's like my activism energy comes from, which pours down into the doula. I think what might be essentially touches the doula heart in my chart is my Venus in Taurus, because a lot of people that I have in my life that are Taurus, they have that very caregiving, loving, showing up for everybody around them besides themselves. So I will give credit to the Venus and Taurus for being the reason why I'm a doula.
Oh, I love that. I love that. I mean, and I think that like not to turn this into just an astrology interview, but like I feel
Hey,
like that Venus Taurus energy is so beautiful because I think when I think about Taurus energy, there's like both that like very giving, like very caring, but like it's an earth sign, like it's like a very grounded, like it's not just a like I'm just giving of myself like like
mhm.
without like knowing who I am or what I'm doing, or like I'm not in some like savior complex mindset, right? There is
Yeah,
that like real groundedness of like this is coming from like who I am.
yes.
And I oh
Like so many of like one of my best friends is a Taurus, and even a lot of Taurus I come across. So they're like, Luar, you need something? You want something? What can I do for you? I'm like, y'all just live for caring.
and what's your favorite thing about being a queer support person or about working with queer and trans folks and families?
There's so many things, but the one thing I can really touch upon is being in space with people like me or people that belong in the same spectrum of gender expansive identities like me. We don't get that. Like when you talk to a lot of queer, trans, or gender non-conforming, non-binary people, we're very isolated, or we're very in very small communities. That is not for me. It's not enough. Um, Ideally, I want a community in terms of the arm's distance, like the way we can touch things. But one of my favorite things in doing this work, being myself a queer, non-binary femme, is showing up for others that like me. And it's such a different feeling because we can actually take off a lot of burden off our shoulders. We can take down that thick skin that we put up to protect ourselves in a lot of cis spaces. Um, so seeing that easy breath, that fresh air that goes into our lungs when we're in space and community with others like ourselves is one of the things that just fills me up with joy. And even outside of reproductive safe spaces, when I show up in very sacred safe space with my bestie, my trans besties, or like other trans kins, it's just it's just amazing just being in community, actual authentic community, not a community that is just built on trauma bonding. um yes, because that's a lot of that. A community, I don't want that. I don't want our community to be built on trauma bonding or oppression Olympics and titles and this like that. But when we get together and we find others like ourselves, there's just the authentic and unconditional love and support that we give to each other. It's just amazing. So that is just like one of my favorite things I love seeing when I, as a full spectrum worker, show up with somebody or a client that has those same identities, and they're like, oh my God, I don't have to educate you, I don't have to explain what a pronoun is, I don't have to do this free labor, I can just exist and be me, and I don't have to explain myself. And that's just like one of the most beautiful things to see, because then I can take that off your shoulder and do that for you. And I think that's like one of the things that just keeps me going. It's just the amount of queer, transgender, non-conforming, non-binary people that exist, that are giving birth, that are just getting surgeries or doing hormone support, just need community members to show up for them for care. It's just beautiful to witness and experience and be able to offer that. So that's one of my favorite things among so many reasons.
Oh, that good queer and trans magic.
Yes, hella queer trans magic.
Oh. And if you could improve one thing about the experience of pregnancy and birth for queer and trans folks, what's one thing that you would want to see?
Everything.
I know.
Everything. um, I just want to see. Oh, just I just want to see us enter medical spaces or healthcare spaces and not having to experience transphobia from its individual to its systemic um, levels. So seeing that for our communities, just for them just to just enter a healthcare and not worry about being misgender or being used the wrong pronouns or being dead named, or actually giving them care that they have a right and deserve to center in their identities is something that I wish to see. If that answers the question.
Oh, it sure does. Yeah.
Because it's really hard to pinpoint one exact thing
Yeah.
when the future that most of us see for ourselves and for our communities is everything.
Yeah.
Everything. If I have to do one specific thing, end all corrective surgeries for intersex children and babies. That is
Fuck
not the
yeah.
first thought for a medical doctor and MD to be like, we need to correct this. That would be one thing as a start, like end corrective surgeries for intersex babies.
Yes. And what's on sort of the flip side of that, what's a piece of advice that you have for new or aspiring queer and trans birth workers?
I think you heard this before, and I think a lot of others who know me have heard me say, but my favorite line is fuck imposter syndrome. It's the besides dysphoria, for those of us who experience dysphoria, the other next thing will be fuck imposter syndrome. Don't doubt, don't question. It's hard. It's easier said than done. But the moment we allow confidence to take hold of us in terms of the work that we're doing in this specific work, in this specific space, by just repeating that mantra and also having others who just instill confidence in you and support you and just inject that into you. That's going to be my mantra for newer folks. It's fuck imposter syndrome. Like, we can do this work. We have a right to do this work. And we have the right to stand up for ourselves and others who are like us so we can show up for those people too. And don't question your ability. A certification or a training does not give you the doula title. That's always been inside of us as human beings, as people that have come from community center, backgrounds and cultures and traditions. Nothing can give you the doula heart. Nothing can give you the doula role. Now, training or certification is going to give you that, because that's not something they can instill. That's something that's always existed. It's just being awakened through a training. And you can exist totally outside of that, but don't expect that a training or certification is going to give you what you're looking for. It's just going to give you the tools and the resources and the foundations for you to do the work. But the role and the work itself has always existed inside you, because it's essentially and fundamentally you as a human being showing up for another human being.
Oh, so good. So good. I want a classic looking like cross stitch that I can frame somewhere that just says fuck imposter syndrome.
I need something like that, or a t-shirt. I need a t-shirt. With a big old trans flag on it.
Oh, I love. Oh, wow. Are there, aside from making that t-shirt, are there any projects that you want help cross-pollinating with others in the community, stuff you're thinking about, stuff you're building?
Yes. So one of the main things that I have not announced yet, I'm actually working quietly behind the scene, is something that I'm creating called a support circle and a space called the Lavender Tent. And it's basically sacred safe space for queer trans, gender nonconforming, non-binary people to come together to do sacred storytelling and basically share our lived experiences and just to give us our support through different parts of our transition, whether it's just medically or non-medically. And an example like that will be having one of those spaces, well, not spaces, but one of the modules or coming together or like getting on the Zoom call virtual space is going to be talking about metaphorical death. So like that's an example, like coming together as queer trans people to talk about our metaphorical deaths and the multitudes of metaphorical deaths that we go through. And so that would look like, what does honoring and grieving and mourning individually and collectively over our past self, our former selves, our former pronouns, our former dead name, and how do we give the personal eulogy to that, and how do we just go through a process of grieving and mourning that, so like that we can make space for the new affirming identities and being to root itself in ourselves. So it's like honoring the decaying. So like that's an example of one of the support circles, but it's called the Lavender Tent, and it's going to be something that I'm going to announce hopefully soon in terms of giving sacred space, that's sacred safe space for us to come together as a community to talk about things like that through sacred storytelling.
Oh, so amazing, so important, so needed. Oh, I love that so much. And what's something that's like not reproductive related about you and your life that you want to share?
There's a lot of things, but one of the big things about me is my practices in Afro-Caribbean traditions that I'm a part of. I'm also a witch. I practice witchcraft, so like those are very fundamental in terms of like being medicine for me, but also it's also cultural and ancestral for me. It's the thing that keeps me together and sane. And outside of that, I also do spoken word, and I do a lot of writings and poem. And I'm also an artist, but I keep my artwork to myself because I'm very very weird and sensitive with showing my artwork. But outside of reproductive healthcare spaces, that's a lot of the big parts of me that people might not know about.
Yeah. And finally, where can people find you on the internet?
Everywhere. I'm on Facebook as Little Moonlight Doula. I'm also on Instagram as Little Moonlight Doula. I also have a website, littlemoonlightdoula.com. So it's just, I made sure the name was grabbed across the spectrum of social media platforms. But yeah, so Facebook, Instagram, and my website is literally just Little Moonlight Doula.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much. This has been such a treat.
Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. I appreciate it.